Hello, everyone, and welcome for this fireside chat where we'll be discussing STEAM education, STEAM concepts, the maker movement, and the intersection of art with science. And today I'd like to introduce our guest, Elizabeth Koprucki, who is let me bring up my notes as I am all over the place right now. The Assistant Director of Fab Lab and Design at University of Chicago's Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and who is also a NASA JPL Solar Systems Ambassador, along with a long history working in graphic design and art. But that's enough me speaking, introducing you. Elizabeth, welcome. If you'd like to
Thank
introduce
you.
yourself, please.
Yeah, so thank you, Evan, for the introduction. As you mentioned, I work at the University of Chicago as part of our Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship, which is the center combining everything entrepreneurship at the university, all across campus, and also some of our programming and such open to the wider community. So I run our Fab Lab and prototyping programming, bringing design and concepts of fabrication to people creating products, to researchers creating tools for research. I've worked with a number of university classes as well. I've been active in the maker community in Chicago since 2012. I've been a maker professional since 2013, starting out at the Ancona School, creating an after-school program, doing some work at the Art Institute and the library. And as I mentioned before that, I worked as a graphic designer. And I've also been I volunteer as a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador. So I'm one of over 1,000 faces of the Jet Propulsion Lab, presenting robotic spaceflight to our communities. And I've been doing that since 2014.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I guess to sort of start with your origin story, you've made the transition now from graphic design into that working sort of in a more STEM-oriented STEAM field. How did you start out deciding to go to study graphic design initially?
So the intersection of art and science is very important to me. And the biggest reason for that is that there was a time where I thought I had to decide between them. Now, granted, I was in high school, and this was, mumble years ago, 20, so for 20 years ago. So at the time, I've been making things for a long time. The first thing I really was making was jewelry, which I've been doing for 23 years. I was, really interested in digital art, in, layout and design and all sorts of things. And so my thought, it's a bit of a winding path, but my thought was, I want to work in art and design. The way to do that and make money is to do graphic design. And it was interesting to me, the aspects of communicating. And when I did, in some of my various, work, I took art classes in high school. I went to a magnet school where I had a chance to do a lot of things. So I also did creative writing, which I still love. And I did dance and, and science, and they kind of interweaved in my work. So some of my art was inspired by the Hubble Space Telescope very early on. And I realized that with a lot, like even when I was doing painting, I like to incorporate text. So it made graphic design make sense to me, but there's always this thread of interest in science and technology. So I can go from there about how that became, how I got involved with the maker community from there, because
That's actually my next question. So please.
Amazing. It's like I looked at the questions.
Who would have thought?
Right. So from there, I graduated with a degree in graphic design and minored in art history and sociology. I say that I've used all of those as a maker professional, and I'm extremely serious about that. The economic outlook for the creative industries in 2006 and 2008, when I moved to Chicago, was less than awesome. I did manage to work in graphic design, and I've done that. Particularly interested in working with nonprofits, but there's always been this other thread of making of 3D work, of things that are tactile, and the interest in science and tech. So at one point in 2012, I was actually working at the Museum of Science and Industry in the Mythbusters exhibit. And so, watching lots of Mythbusters, and they're all solving problems and making stuff. And what I didn't understand at the time was they were using digital fabrication technology. This was also when my partner joined Pumping Station 1 Hackerspace or Makerspace in Chicago. And, he's like, oh, you got to see this. It's like a Mythbusters space. And it was an intersection of a lot of things, because it's also there was a day where we went to the museum for funsies, and it was right after the Curiosity rover had landed on Mars. So I had periodically followed a little bit about Spirit and Opportunity, Voyager's continuing mission, et cetera, and thought that was really interesting. Like I said, I really love Hubble for returning the amazing imagery, and that was a draw for all of this. And then I started reading about this Curiosity rover and saw the exhibit with a life-size model. I was like, wow, like this really, just something about it really captured my imagination. And it was the first time I saw 3D printing at MSI's Fab Lab. So it was just this amazing intersection of stuff. And I thought, what is this? So I started digging into robotic spaceflight. It was like remembering, like, oh, this is something I'm interested in. This is like, people talk about the end of the shuttle program and some of the different things that were changing with human spaceflight around that time. But it's like, wow, there's all this stuff is still going on. There's all these amazing missions that aren't talked about a lot in the news. And that really captured my interest. I'm a little bit of a hipster. If something is obscure, or if I feel like it's obscure, I do tend to go towards it a little bit. So it sort of sparked that interest. And then, of course, these amazing images coming back from Mars, the engineering of the Curiosity mission, the fact that Opportunity rover was still active. So it was really, and I was thinking at the time, what do I want to do with my career? Because one of the things I'd really loved about graphic design was information design. And I was thinking, what if it didn't have to be a choice? What if that was actually a false dichotomy? What would it look like? We talk about graphic design as visual communication. So what would visual science communication mean? And I actually set out a plan of different things I wanted to learn about. I was in between freelancing and working retail and such, I was watching a lot of telecoms from NASA, from JPL. And I started, I was looking at science communicators on Twitter. I was looking at different websites and thinking, how can I get into this? And at the time, I was also intrigued by 3D printing. So there were a group of people at Pumping Station 1, and I had started going to events there. The interesting thing is that I felt like I was not very technical. I will go back to this about why I actually had the knowledge I need, but I didn't feel like I was very technical. But they had a meetup for 3D printing, and they had a picture of a 3D printed Curiosity. And I thought, I want a 3D printed model of Curiosity. And then that very quickly evolved to, I want to learn how to do this myself. And from there, because part of me, I'm very tactile, I make jewelry, I do a lot of things. So part of me understanding things is understanding how they work and taking them apart. So it pretty much, once I joined the makerspace, went from learning how to use the thing to learning how to repair the thing, which is definitely a part of 3D printer usage, period. Mm-hmm. And then to building my own, and there was a build club for people making machines for digital fabrication, aka computer numerical control, which I know some folks were talking about earlier. So this is a very long evolution, but basically I went from feeling like a complete newbie to having the opportunity to build my own CNC machine with a kit that someone had donated to the space, and then understanding like how things fit together. And going from that within about 6 months to being asked for my advice, and like realizing I was no longer the newbiest newbie in the room. And along the way, I was thinking, how could I pivot? People are noticing me. I was visible in this field in a way that I was not as much in graphic design. So, but this is the part where I come in and say, I also really had the skills that I needed. Because with graphic design, my favorite program was Adobe Illustrator, was vector drawing. So that the ability to make mathematical shapes, that is what is translated into the input into things like a vinyl cutter, a computer numerically controlled router, a laser cutter, these things that move in 2 dimensions, maybe control something about the height, the Z, but basically they're just following a mathematical path. And these softwares are very powerful, but they also have a huge learning curve. But I say now I don't cry over Illustrator because I did, 14 years ago. I'm not like super much exaggerating. So knowing the software was really valuable, was actually gave me an in into understanding the hardware, because in terms of digital fabrication, the hardware is complex and worthy of respect, but it's not the most complicated part I have found. So I was seeing a synthesis of my interest in design, my getting involved in the maker community, my longtime interest in teaching and mentoring, that I had an opportunity to do that. And I was thinking, like, how could I pivot into this, visual science communicator sort of role? And I found out about the NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador Program. I thought, hey, I want to do this. I want to do STEM and STEAM communication. And then with all of this, about a year after Curiosity landed on Mars, and a year after I joined Pumping Station 1, an opportunity came across to start a maker after school program at a private school in my neighborhood that I was familiar with. And I thought, hey, this is interesting. Like, it's a risk, but I can think of these things. Let's do it. I ended up getting hired, designing that program, and co-teaching it. And one of the fun things about that was that then that was some evidence to say, like, I've done this STEM and STEAM communication. It gets me further to where I want to be. And that was actually part of my NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador application. And along the way, I found out that while I was not as interested in the 2D graphic design, I love the maker work. I love teaching people about it. I love the way that it touched on science and technology. So eventually, another year after that, after a couple of other teaching gigs, I started at the University of Chicago. So that has been, and had the chance to design our Fab Lab and run it and design the programming, which in a lot of ways things have come full circle, because I work with a number of scientists. I work on getting people into the space to make things for their research. I work with people creating medical devices. I also worked on our partnership with the Hyde Park Art Center. So it kind of all comes together there. So I will stop there. That is a longer version of that story than I usually tell.
Certainly. Thank you. And you've already started to touch on the next question, but I wanted to take a quick moment for a brief, just sort of a segue, because you mentioned this term information design and how you're interested in it. And I haven't ever heard of that before. So I was curious if you could just explain a little bit what information design is.
Yeah, right on. It's gotten more popular these days with infographics. Especially, I think there was maybe not as much anymore, but there was a time a bit ago where like everything was just burgeoning infographics. But it is a way of communicating information. I believe Albert Cairo has, there's a number of people who have some fascinating descriptions of like looking at maps and charts. There's a classic example of like Napoleon's campaign of like his forces going to and from Russia. It was a very old school example. A map is information design. Anything, I would say communicating information or data in a visual way. Another classic information design problem is stove knobs.
Mhm.
how are your stove knobs labeled? Because, and wayfinding is another big one. Anything with like charts, schedules, graphs, etc., would be information design.
Mhm. Wonderful. It definitely sounds like it's, again, one of those disciplines that really falls within the spectrum between art and science. There is a design aspect to it, but there's also a very technical aspect in that you have to relay information. So I think this also helps to parlay into sort of the next topic that we're going to talk about, which is kind of the distinction that was made about 10 to 15 years ago between the STEM movement and then the addition of art to make it into STEAM. In that, I remember back when I was in college around 2010 or so, that there was a lot of talk and controversy in the academic community, especially from more of the traditional STEM branches, that art didn't really fit into the curriculum, and that by adding it, you were diluting it down. But you know, as a whole, you can see that argument has been rejected, and there's really been a really great sort of harmony between the four quote unquote technical disciplines and this more creative artistic aspect that is being sort of taught alongside of it. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what does an appreciation for the arts, bring to the other four disciplines?
Yes.
Mm,
So there's a number of ways to look at it. I think the kind of the easiest way in is to think of design,
mhm,
because design from the art side and design from the engineering side have some things in common. I've had conversations. I have a brother who's an engineer. I have another friend in design with a brother's engineer. How that falls out. But I can understand when it's talking about design to requirements. Like there's a practical and a good enough, and does it do the thing it's supposed to do, that is part of design and part of engineering design. With graphic design, we design to a brief. I'm kind of industrial design adjacent now, or at least I work with people doing that. So there's a user experience, and you would hope on the engineering side, meeting the engineering requirements and also being something that people can interact with. So these things, I think those boundaries are fairly fluid. And then one of the most useful things that I almost took for granted until I started my current job was design as an iterative process. Because prototyping is not immediately obvious to everyone, which makes sense, of course, if you don't learn it. But the idea that the first time you're going to do it, it's not going to be right, that you're going to learn and iterate, that comes up in engineering. Of course, certainly with experimentation, the scientific method, it comes up with writing, and it comes up with prototyping. These art and science and technology are already interwoven. Definitely, again, in terms of, so you introduce a technology, how do people use it? How do people want it? How is someone going to interface with it? There's going to be some aspect of art and design to make it usable and useful. With science, I talked a lot about the visual aspects, and those I'm very interested in the amateur image processing of space data. So those images are data. They are things coming back from different instruments. And I think this was a question later on, but there was a book, I think it's called The Hubble Space Telescope and the Astronomical Sublime. And the thesis of it is that when the people working with the Hubble data get the raw data back, there's still aesthetic decisions being made about what colors to use and how to put the different filters together to produce the final result. And I believe the thesis of that book is that it's actually some of the colors and the choices made by people in putting those images together into a final form was inspired by Romanticism and like specific images of American landscapes during the 19th century Romantic movement, which is a whole lot to unpack. But and I'm not as familiar with math. I did just run across someone talking on Twitter about how when you get pretty far into math, it looks a lot like philosophy. And so,
True statement.
Yeah, to take some of those, I know people love math 3D printing, so taking those formulas, translating them to something that can be made and adapted into a visual or a tactile form. And also, creating art is not separate from technology. It's never been. Whether technology is, red ochre and a handprint on the cave wall, or a computer numerically controlled water jet for carving a big piece of steel or something. It's never been separate. And I think, it drives each other. I don't have good evidence on one end, about art driving technology, although I'm almost certain it's the case. Technology certainly drives what art is possible. Well, it's rambly, but I hope it helps.
No, and it's, it really kind of falls back on a lot of sort of older, I guess, stereotypes you saw, in the STEAM community. Like I remember, back in engineering school, you always heard about the arguments between like the architects and the civil engineers when it comes to designing a building. The architects make a pretty building, but it's going to collapse, and the civvies make a really, really sturdy building, and you can't find the door. There's no windows. So it's interesting to note, not even interesting, but important to note that, both of these topics, the form and function have to come together, and, you can't look at them independently. And then just to comment on another point that you brought up in regards to the photos from NASA, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard somewhere that those photos actually come back in grayscale and then they false color them when they, on Earth. So again, the choices that they make in color are, subjective and mostly aesthetic in order to help relay, the idea of, what this object is in space. So.
Yeah, that is true in a lot of cases. So a lot of times, depending on the camera, and it's really exciting because cameras can be, of course, things that show visible wavelengths and have filters reflecting different wavelengths of visible light. They can be ultraviolet, they can be infrared, they can be, sensitive or like on a band where methane is visible, like different parts of the spectrum. So there's also synthetic aperture radar, where it looks like a photograph, but actually dark means smooth and bright means rough, which then you could also, so really possibly the first images from a robotic spacecraft I saw were from Magellan at Venus. A really lovely article in National Geographic in the mid-90s, I think. So what they could do is take some of the laser altimeter data and turn it into a 3D rendering, which is like 1994, a big deal. And turn it into 3D rendering, so then you can sort of use that altimeter data to get a sense of what the synthetic aperture radar is showing you. And the synthetic aperture radar is used to see through clouds, I should say. But yeah, and a lot of, again, it depends on the camera. So something like Cassini mission at Saturn, the 2 Voyager probes, the Mars exploration rovers, aka Spirit and Opportunity, all had cameras with different filters. So they would put for example, for Mars exploration rovers, they'd put a red filter over, take a photograph, put a green filter, blue, and then those come through, they look at grayscale images that then you can composite in an image processing software. And with those, if you have calibrated data, you can get something close to a true color, but it is but that's not always the most useful thing. That can be, I mean, that can be good because of course people are curious, like what would it look like if we were there? And like you said, false color can be used for aesthetic reasons, for informational reasons as well, to say, hey, you know, there's a really great photograph of finding these hematite concretions that were called blueberries on Mars. A Mars exploration rover found that. And that was evidence of there being groundwater. So the way those images were processed, they're more gray probably, but the way they were processed, they looked blue. And that sort of helps that stand out. So sometimes these false color images are basically showing prevalences of different minerals. The other interesting thing is for some of the older cameras, like I believe with Voyager, it was actually not red, green, blue, like our eyes or our monitors. It was actually orange, green, violet. So that's already like, there's some decisions being made when you take that into an image processing thing that's expecting an RGB channel. And there's also, you know, sometimes you can denoise things. I've seen, you know, amateurs using color data from one camera on Curiosity to colorize a black and white photo from another camera on Curiosity. And the interesting thing, so with the Curiosity rover, her big mast camera like on her head is actually like our cell phone cameras. So instead of with that, you actually get color photos right off. It's got all of the channels in it. So while there's some question, we don't know if that's what our eyes would see on Mars. It's definitely what our cell phone cameras would see. And there are some images where they'll go and adjust the white balance. So the thought is it's closer to what our eyes would see. It's interesting. It's more tan than red. Some of the early images like really had this exaggerated red color, but it's more tan. Still cool.
Wonderful. And I guess while we're already on this tangent, we can skip ahead to this question that we had about the idea that NASA really has been both intentionally and unintentionally creating art since its inception. You know, with the number of photos that it takes, you know, the recordings, the simulations, you know, the sound recordings. And I mean, in fact, there's an entire image gallery on the nasa.gov page just for sharing images with the public. So I wanted to ask, how does NASA make use of artistry while it's conducting its research? And is that a key sort of concern for them as they go forward with their work?
So, I mean, answering as one, a volunteer.
Certainly, of
and
course.
As, you know, the history is really interesting because the first planetary missions didn't have a camera. In fact, the very first U.S. NASA mission planetary mission was Mariner 2 at Venus, which did not carry a camera. And then Mariner 4 at Mars did. And from then, a lot, but not all missions do. But you're right, there's microphones, there's all kinds of different ways to engage. So I think over time, at least with planetary missions, it's been seen as more important. In fact, the Juno mission that's at Jupiter right now has the Juno Cam. So that was specifically put on as an outreach tool. And there's a whole thing where amateur astronomers can upload their images of Jupiter and pick out regions that they'd like, you know, closer images of. And then Juno on her perigeo, so that's the closest approach to Jupiter, will take some of those pictures, zoom in like, oh, that's an interesting storm. Or you can also pick them out on previous panoramas that Juno has taken. And then there's also a gallery for people to do their own image processing, both in, when you see, so this is kind of, you kind of brought up a good point, so mild tangent. When you see something like Curiosity's selfies, or when you see a full disk image of Jupiter in a lot of detail, that was made as a composite. So there's, the way cameras work, it's really just getting little bits that have to be put together. And those can be put together with the idea of getting the most accurate image or with getting sort of a less accurate but visually appealing result. So one of the questions that comes up with Curiosity's selfies So she's got a camera on her mast, and I'm gesturing like it's my hand because it's tactile, right? So she's taking pictures around her like a selfie. But the reason you don't see the robotic arm in those images is that it's been edited out. Those are composites of like 50 to 60 to sometimes more photos that are then sometimes the perspective, like because of the angles the different pictures are taken, some of them like sort of have this like weird distance fisheye perspective. Sometimes they don't. It's kind of the decisions made in the processing, but all of those have to be put together by humans. And I actually a while ago did an event at Adler Planetarium where we did selfies from space and did that as an analog. So we cut out little bits of, like I found all of the pictures that went into a composite, cut them out, and then people could assemble them in different ways. Oh, cool. So I think art is important. There's been some really interesting public outreach programs developed for the Discovery program. So there's kind of 3 classes of robotic missions that NASA is doing right now. There's the big flagship mission, so that's Curiosity, Cassini. I believe Mars 2020 would be considered a flagship mission that's got like the highest budget. There's the middle one, which is called New Frontiers. New Horizons was the first of those. And then there's and those are basically, so the flagship missions are based on the decadal survey of planetary scientists, where they all will comment and say, like, this is what is most important to us in our field right now. The other 2 smaller ones are actually publicly, well, among researchers competed. So they will submit mission plans and it has to match a particular profile. So New Horizons that went past Pluto and went past Arrokoth in the Kuiper Belt was a New Frontiers mission. And then the kind of the smallest budget missions are Discovery. Those, I believe Juno and Dawn were them. There's been a lot of, forget which one Messenger was. Like, there's been a lot of very sophisticated missions. Even when I'm like, this is the smallest budget, like, they're still amazing. So with those, the office that does those also has these amazing, like, bits of curriculum and workshops that they've developed. And one of them is called, like, Art and the Cosmic Connection. So it's looking at different aspects of design and then also looking at how you see them in a space, an image from space. So kind of like, finding, lines and shapes, and then in a scientific image, that means craters, and that means, recurring slope lineae, the darker channels that are darker channels that show up on Mars, stuff like that. So it's really cool, and then everybody goes and like makes their own space-based pastel art. So I've actually presented that before at the library. And they've done another, I think there's like a rover engineering activity. There's a lot of this publicly available curriculum.
Fantastic. And honestly, I could just make an entire convention about space exploration, but I don't want to. I don't want to take up the entire time with just talk on NASA. So I want to kind of come back to the idea of the maker movement and ask you, as somebody who is deeply entrenched within that community, what makes somebody a maker?
We were talking about this last night. So that is a really interesting question, because on one hand, humans and hominids have been making tools and making things for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. So it is one of the things that we do. And on the other hand, about 15 years ago, some folks in Silicon Valley discovered the physical world. Okay. Not actually, but in the past 15 years or so, there are some technologies that have become somewhat cheaper. For example, microcontrollers, more cheap, somewhat cheaper and more available. 3D printing being a big one of those. And there's also been an intersection of the DIY movement that was kind of big in the 80s and continues to be big, with, bringing together this art and science and technology. So at one point when I was getting ready to go to my first maker job, someone was like, what are you doing in 20 words or less? And I said, I am teaching people to make things using art, science, and technology. So, and with that, we've seen, I don't know if it's 16 years ago, the first Fab Lab was founded out of the Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT. Make Magazine got started. So that's part of my comments on Silicon Valley discovers the physical world. But like there are lots of people who've been advancing this idea of making and of a self-described maker movement. I think it also comes from a desire to have agency over technology and to kind of understand what's going on with tech. But there's also, what's interesting to me is who self-identifies as a maker and who doesn't, who knows about it and who doesn't, and what does that look like demographically? Because, I mentioned working at the Hyde Park Art Center, is the Hyde Park Art Center a makerspace? And, is crafts part of the maker movement? Like, I would think so, but there are ways. The self-described maker movement can skew very white and male. And some other sorts of making activities may still skew white, but do not necessarily skew male. So it's interesting, like, what does a maker look like? Just like a question, what does a scientist look like? And there's lots of people who've been working on making it more inclusive, connecting folks who, connecting all these different aspects of making. So I did not invent any of these discussion points, and I'm really listening and learning from others.
And, I think it's really interesting how you bring up the idea of identity, because I think kind of a lot of our discussion when it comes to makers has been rooted in history. You brought up the DIY movement that was, really sort of not peaked, but, came into its own in the 80s. But even before that, I think if you look back to the 40s and 50s, there was this real kind of sense that when you had a device, you could open it up and fix it yourself. As technology has gotten more sophisticated and we're starting to use ICs, PCBs, and it's harder to really work with things, especially as they become more electronic and, miniaturized, people have become more removed from the technology that they're using, so they don't feel as empowered to be able to work on their own devices. So I'm kind of curious, how that has played into, the definition of what a maker is. And I've also been fascinated how we kind of talk about also, we still have mechanics and all that, but they're not really included in the discussion when we talk about, sort of the maker movement.
Yeah, that is super valid. That's repair is also part of it. And I think, unfortunately, that may point out to unexamined class issues of is this someone doing this as there's some things to unpack there. Like, what is someone working on? Like, is it seen as shiny? Is this like a technologist who's a wealthy technologist doing this as a hobby? Because unfortunately, some of these things can be expensive. Maker spaces can make that easier, but again, you have to be able to have money to join them, have access, have it be a good community, etc. But I'm glad that people are pointing this out. And I think, I see connected with making also the importance of repair. And like you said, I know there's people work on like the right to repair, because in some cases with devices, like you're actually, at least for warranties and such, one is discouraged from opening them. But I do think part of the interest comes from a desire to feel more empowered about technology, and I think it also, in education, sometimes people point towards shop classes and towards, one of my grandpas was a shop teacher. One of my grandpas was a tool and die maker for RCA Astro Electronics. It's a NASA contractor. And there's, you know, when I talk to people, there's often someone in their family who worked in manufacturing, and or, you know, shop class. There's just like this common thing. So I think part of the interest in the maker movement, I mean, there's people see a lot of things in it, you know, driving an interest in STEM, driving an interest in manufacturing potentially, you know, driving an interest in people understanding what's going on with their stuff. And there are, you know, with the mechanic discussion, I should also not make this into a total false dichotomy, because there is what I would consider a maker space for cars. Your head workbench, I think that's what it's called, your head workspace, in Bridgeport. Again, I don't know how things have been since this March. And there's certainly, I should also comment that there are also things like power racing, and there are places that, there are maker spaces that have some sort of automotive aspect. So it isn't as cut and dried. So I should say it's out there, even if it's not something I personally have participated in.
Certainly. And with just about 8 minutes left, I want to bring things full circle and sort of pull in your work with the University of Chicago, in that, you know, in your position, I'm sure that you work with a lot of companies, a lot of entrepreneurs who are, you know, developing new products, doing a lot of R&D. And I wonder sort of what are the parallels and differences between you sort of working in an R&D capacity and then working on something as a maker?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a lot of similarities. It does sound like we would be a super sophisticated R&D place. We definitely have people who are doing amazing research. We do have some professional grade 3D printers, but a lot of the prototyping and the focus, the idea that this is something, this isn't just a personal project, it's something that's going to be prototyped and hopefully become a product that can be scaled. That is a little different, but day to day, it's not a lot. And I find that I often encourage people to be tinkering and iterating. A lot of what I see is actually something I can recognize in myself, because I felt like when I came to the maker movement, I relearned how to learn. And that was what was really valuable and powerful to me, to realize that I could learn by doing and learn by failing. And if I didn't automatically understand something, it was okay, because I could learn about it. And that was not, as a gifted labeled kid, that was not exactly my educational experience. And I think students and others, and it's not most people's educational experience. So with a lot of the folks I talk to, it's good to say, like, no, it's okay to screw up. And that's where that sort of iterative process of graphic design is useful, where it's like, yes, we're going for this fancy thing, but that's actually not where we are right now. Where we are right now is sketching and making something in modeling clay. And we're not even going to jump straight to the computer. So it's interesting because it has this focus and purpose, but in the actual activities that are happening, it's not necessarily a whole lot different.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we're just about 5 minutes left. I want to make sure that I got to the few comments that we got from the audience. The first one being from Pan. Thank you. I work in a cloud storage, and you made me wonder about mashing up visualizations like file size and frequency of access as a kind of 3D mesh texture. And I think that was in regards to our discussion about information design.
That would be so cool. And I was talking about 2D information design. 3D information design is absolutely a thing. And you can see some of that from NASA, and some of that with, you can see it like Adler Planetarium. Both, there are some things that are really well represented in 3 dimensions. It's interesting, and also potentially, and also very valuable for blind and low vision patrons. I've also seen someone do this with diabetes data, like their monthly blood sugar data.
Thank you, wonderful. And then we had another post from Paula Lieberman, actually a quote attributed to Paul Dirac. "This is beautiful, therefore it must be true," which I think is a really common sort of statement in the sciences, especially in mathematics. Like if you talk to enough mathematicians, they always talk about equations needing to be beautiful and elegant, and that's how you know that they're correct, which is something that kind of personally irks me as a more of a physics guy, knowing that, you know, sometimes the equation is just difficult. But it definitely, there is that aesthetic notion in the sciences and math, and there always has been.
Yeah, that's great.
So
Any other questions? Or?
let's see. I don't think we've received anything else from the audience. So I guess just in our last few minutes, if you had any sort of parting remarks or statements or anything you wanted to pitch, please.
Oh man. Do stuff, try stuff, be creative, be bad at things. Whoever it was who said anything worth doing is worth doing badly, like that's the biggest thing. And it's really, I feel like in my work, I end up coaching people in creativity, which is really fun. And it applies to a lot of things, learning art, writing, like show up and do the thing badly, but safely. That is when I work with people, the joking thing is that our standard of success is that no one was injured, nothing is on fire, and the machine was not broken. Hopefully we get something else, but like if we just hit that baseline, it was a good day. And I think my other pitch is that there's a phenomenal amount of data and information coming back from robotic space missions. From NASA specifically, I talk about them a lot. I'm in the US, I'm a JPL solar system ambassador, and all of their stuff is public domain. With some of the other space agencies, like the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency, a lot of their data is also available. Check the copyrights and do your image credits and everything, but there's just so unbelievably much out there. It can be like drinking from a fire hose, but it's rich and super, super worth it. There's the Mars 2020 mission is past the halfway point on its way to Mars. Super exciting. So look for that landing next year. And I guess, so I made a piece of jewelry with Gale Crater.
That's lovely.
Thank you. So it's a 3D print of Gale Crater. It's beads representing Phobos and Deimos and Mars. And the little pendant is stamped and it says, "Stay curious." So that is definitely my parting remarks. Stay curious. Thank you.
Very nice. And with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. So once again, I want to thank our panelist, Elizabeth Koprucki. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate you sharing your time with us. And with that, we will go ahead and end this session. And we have our next panel coming up at 2 o'clock. So please stay tuned for that. All right. Thank you very much.